What if I told you that the reason the person you're drawn to doesn't look at you the way you want has nothing to do with your looks, with what you own, or with what you do for them, but with something happening in a place you can't see, deep inside your own nervous system, in a part of you that acts before your conscious mind even has a chance to form a thought? Because there's something most men never discover, something no school teaches, something that never comes up between friends, something you won't find in any book on the subject, and yet it shapes everything in the landscape of attraction. And it's this: calm is the oldest language of strength, and the man who masters it never needs to chase anyone, because people naturally gravitate toward whoever radiates that deep steadiness, that stability that doesn't crack under a silence, that doesn't wobble at a rejection, that never begs for a reply. I know what you're thinking. It sounds great in theory, but the truth is that when someone truly matters to you, holding on to that calm is one of the hardest things there is, because your brain isn't on your side. Your brain has its own agenda, and that agenda was written long before you ever met the person you can't stop thinking about. And in this video, I'm going to walk you through exactly what's happening inside it, why you react the way you do, and what you can do to take back control of something that, without anyone ever explaining it to you, you've been losing for years. The Stoic philosopher Epictetus taught that what happens to us matters less than how we choose to respond, and the ability to stay grounded in the face of uncertainty, to remain steady when your nervous system is screaming at you to panic, is the most powerful response you can build. It's what separates the man ruled by his emotions from the man who rules them. But before we go further, I need you to sit with this for a second. Think of a specific moment, that message you sent that got no reply. That moment you rushed to be available and felt something shift in the dynamic, even though you couldn't name it. That feeling that the more you gave, the less it seemed to matter. Do you remember that feeling? Good, because it has an explanation. And that explanation has a name. And once you know it, you'll never look at your own reactions the same way again. Let's start with something neuroscientists have studied for decades, something most men never connect to their own relationships, let alone to why those relationships keep going wrong in the same way. The autonomic nervous system. That system controls your breathing, your heart rate, the tension in your muscles, the pace of your thoughts, without asking your permission. It has two main states. One is activation, alertness, a response to whatever the brain reads as a threat. The other is calm, safety, openness. And here's something I want you to sit with, because it changes everything that follows. When you wait for a reply that never comes, when you read someone's silence as proof that something's gone wrong, when that urge hits to send one more message just to see what happens, your nervous system has already slipped into alert mode. Not because you're in actual danger, but because your brain has automatically and unconsciously filed that moment away as a threat to your social survival. That's not a figure of speech. It's literally what's happening on a neurological level. Humans are social animals, and across millions of years of evolution, being accepted or cast out by the group wasn't about ego, it was about survival. Whoever got left outside the group didn't make it. And that same alarm system that kept us alive for millennia is exactly what fires today when someone you're attracted to leaves you on red. The problem is that system can't tell a real threat from an imagined one. It can't tell the difference between a predator crouched in the grass on the plains and 2 hours of silence on your phone screen. To your nervous system, both trigger the same cascade of responses, and that cascade is what drives you toward decisions that, from the outside, make absolutely no sense. Texting more, over-explaining yourself, hunting for signals that aren't there, reading every small gesture as confirmation of your worst fear. The Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius wrote that you have power over your mind, not over outside events, and that realizing this is where your strength begins. Once you understand your nervous system is reacting to a perceived threat and not a real one, you can start exercising that power. You can start telling the difference between what's a real signal and what's just noise your own anxiety is generating, and that distinction alone is the first step toward reclaiming control. And here's the paradox that poisons everything. The moment your nervous system slips into alert mode, something in you shifts, and the other person feels it, even if they can't put it into words. Something in your tone, your energy, the way you show up. something that communicates on a level deeper than any word could reach, that you're activated, that something's missing in you, that you need her to do something so you can feel okay. And that, exactly that, is what kills desire. Not because women are cruel, not because they enjoy watching someone suffer, but because desire, on an evolutionary level, ignites in response to signals of strength, of stability, of resources. And anxiety, neediness, that invisible emotional urgency send exactly the opposite message. They broadcast scarcity. They broadcast that this man is missing something he needs. Think about it. Have you ever been around someone desperate for your approval? How did that feel? Did it pull you closer, or did it quietly make you want distance? The answer is almost always the second one, because desperation signals that something's missing, whether or not the person is even aware they're sending that signal. It signals that this person isn't whole on their own, and that incompleteness is something we're wired to instinctively pull away from, not because we're cruel, but because we're built to seek out partners who stand on their own, who can add to a relationship instead of draining it. Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor who ruled one of history's largest empires and still found time amid wars and decisions that cost thousands of lives to write one of the most profound philosophical diaries ever preserved, put it in a way that still holds up almost 2,000 years later. He wrote that it isn't events that disturb us, but the judgments we form about them. In this context, that translates into something very precise. It isn't that person's silence that destabilizes you. It's the meaning your mind attaches to that silence. It's the story you tell yourself about what it means. And that story, more often than not, is completely warped by the state your nervous system is stuck in. But I'm going to tell you something even harder to hear, and I want you to take it in calmly, because it's uncomfortable, but it's true. The intensity you feel towards someone who isn't fully available isn't always love. Sometimes, more often than we'd like to admit, it's anxious activation. It's your nervous system reacting to a pattern of uncertainty that produces the same symptoms as desire, but comes from a completely different place. Psychologists who study attachment have spent decades documenting something that's hard to swallow the first time you hear it, something that reframes almost every relationship you've ever had. The bonding patterns we build in childhood, shaped by how our caregivers did or didn't respond to our needs, become templates the adult brain applies automatically to every intimate relationship it enters. And one of the most striking parts of those templates is that most people feel a stronger pull toward whoever reproduces the pattern they learned as kids, even when that pattern causes them pain. In other words, if as a child you learned that affection was something you had to earn through effort, that it showed up unpredictably, that sometimes it was there and sometimes it wasn't, your adult nervous system will tend to read that same unpredictability in someone else as proof it's worth chasing, as proof this is real, as proof there's something here worth every ounce of effort. And the effect is brutal, because the scarcer that person's attention becomes, the more intense your activation gets. And the more intense your activation, the more chasing behavior you engage in. And the more you chase, the more you radiate that neediness that snuffs out the other person's interest. It's a loop, and you don't escape a loop by trying harder to do the right things from inside it. You escape it the moment you recognize clearly and honestly that you're inside it at all. Seneca wrote that it isn't that we have too little time, it's that we waste so much of it. And one of the biggest wastes is the time we spend chasing people who aren't available. We burn our energy, our attention, our dignity on people who give nothing back. And we do it because our nervous system has been conditioned over years and sometimes decades to chase uncertainty as though it were something precious. But once you spot the pattern clearly, you can start breaking it, piece by piece. Epictetus, the Stoic philosopher born into slavery, who became one of the most influential minds of the ancient world, had something he told his students constantly. He said some things are within our power, and some are entirely outside it, and mistaking one for the other, treating what isn't yours to control as if it were, is the root of nearly all human suffering. In our context, what's within your power is the state you act from, the thoughts you let pass through, and the ones you feed, the decisions you make when the impulse hits and you choose whether to follow it or let it go. What's not within your power is the other person's response, how much interest they feel, whether or not they decide to text you back. And the more energy you pour into controlling what you can't control, the less you have left over to build the one thing that's entirely in your hands, your own state, your own presence, your own peace, and that's where the real work starts. I want to pause here for a second because I know what you might be thinking, and I want to address it head on. Everything I've described might sound like distance, like coldness, like putting up a wall between you and what you feel. It isn't that. I'm not telling you to stop feeling. I'm not suggesting you turn into someone unreachable or emotionally shut off. That's not stability, that's armor. And armor, while it protects you from getting hurt, also blocks real connection from ever reaching you in the first place. What I'm describing is something else entirely. It's the ability to feel deeply without that feeling seizing control of your actions. It's being able to want someone without that want becoming the center of your world. It's being able to care deeply about a person without losing track of who you are when she isn't watching. Daniel Goleman, the psychologist who popularized the idea of emotional intelligence, spent years studying what set apart people who made better decisions under emotional pressure. And what he found runs counter to almost everything people assume about self-control. It wasn't that these people felt less, it was that there was a gap, however small, between the stimulus and the response, a pause where the mind could step in before the impulse turned into action. That gap is everything. That gap is the difference between sending that message out of anxiety or choosing not to send it because you're calm. It's the difference between answering someone's silence with more noise or letting it sit and getting on with your day. It's the difference between shaping your whole day around whether that person responds and shaping it around what's actually yours, what you need to get done, what makes you more whole regardless of the outcome. Epictetus taught that nothing great is built overnight, and the ability to build that gap between stimulus and response isn't built overnight either. It's built through practice, through the willingness to pause, through the discipline of watching your own impulses before you act on them. And as you build that gap, you become less reactive. And as you become less reactive, you become more magnetic. Now here's something I want you to listen to closely, because this is where most conversations on this topic go off the rails. When people talk about mystery in the context of attraction, the most common misread is that it means hiding things on purpose, withholding replies to stir up uncertainty, disappearing for days to see if she comes looking, acting indifferent when you actually feel something. None of that is mystery, no matter how it gets dressed up. That's manipulation. And manipulation, even when it sparks a short-term reaction, builds a dynamic that leads nowhere worth going, and that eventually collapses under its own weight. Real mystery, the kind that sparks genuine and lasting curiosity in another person, doesn't come from what you deliberately hide. It comes from what you genuinely still have left to explore. It comes from being someone who hasn't handed over every part of himself in the first 3 meetings. It comes from having layers, having an inner world that can't be summed up in one conversation, being someone who feels things deeply but doesn't spill everything the second he feels it. Seneca wrote something in his letters that's been quoted for centuries because it still rings true. He wrote that the greatest good is a soul at peace with itself, and though he wrote it in the context of moral philosophy, it connects directly to what we're talking about. A man at peace with himself who doesn't need the outside world to confirm what he already knows about himself projects something with no easy substitute. He projects peace, and peace, in a world where nearly everyone is wired up, anxious and rushing, is one of the rarest and most magnetic qualities there is. Marcus Aurelius wrote that the soul takes on the color of its thoughts. When your thoughts are steeped in calm and self-possession, your soul reflects that, and people will feel it. They'll be drawn to it, not because you're trying to attract them, but because you're a source of stability in a world of chaos. But let's go further still, because up to now we've talked about what happens inside you. There's also something that happens between you and the other person that needs naming. When 2 people interact, especially in the early stages of attraction, there's a dynamic psychologists call the relational frame, and once you learn to see it, you start noticing it everywhere. The frame is the unspoken structure that defines who holds more perceived value in the interaction. It's not negotiated out loud. It's not something either person decides on purpose. It sets itself up automatically through very subtle signals in the first exchanges, and the most powerful signal that defines that frame isn't words, it's behavior. Specifically, it's the ratio between what each person invests and what each person gets back. When a man consistently gives more than he receives, when his attention, his time, his emotional availability flow toward the other person in a steady, one-sided way, the frame locks itself into place, and it becomes very hard to reverse without doing something that shakes up the whole dynamic completely, sometimes even painfully so. And that frame says, without a single word, that he needs this more than she does, that she's the prize, that he's auditioning. And once that frame is set, it colors everything that follows, because people don't consciously build it, but they absolutely react to it. And the most common reaction to someone who keeps placing himself beneath the other isn't gratitude. It's indifference, or worse, it's a loss of respect. Now, the antidote to this isn't positioning yourself above her. It's not adopting an air of superiority, or treating anyone with calculated coldness. The antidote is something much simpler, and at the same time much harder. It's reciprocity. It's matching what you give to what you get back, not out of spite or a desire to punish anyone, but as a quiet signal that you value yourself enough not to keep investing endlessly in something that isn't returning that investment. And when that happens, when a man genuinely starts saving his attention for people who deserve it, instead of scattering it everywhere in hopes something comes back, the dynamic shifts. Not always right away, but it shifts because the frame shifts. I want to tell you something. Phycologists, the scientists who study animal behavior in the wild, have documented for decades. In nearly every social species that has ever been studied, the individuals who draw the most attention from others aren't the ones sending out the most signals of need. They're the ones who need the group's approval the least to keep functioning. The ones with their own resources, a clear sense of themselves, a steady internal footing, and a quiet indifference to what others think of them. And even though we're infinitely more complex than any other species, a part of our brain, the oldest part, the part that runs beneath language and conscious thought, still responds to those exact same signals. It still sizes up the people around us by their signals of stability, of resources, of independence, and it still reacts with attraction toward whoever seems to have those things, and with indifference or distance toward whoever seems to lack them. Seneca wrote that true happiness is enjoying the present without anxious dependence on the future. When you're not anxiously dependent on her approval, you can actually enjoy the present moment with her. You can be fully present, fully engaged, fully yourself, and that presence is what makes her want to be near you. Now we arrive at what I think is, without question, the most misunderstood part of this entire topic: purpose. People talk a lot about how a man with purpose is more attractive. And it's true, but the reason it's true isn't what most people assume. It's not that women are drawn to success itself, or money, or visible achievements. The reason runs much deeper than that. A man with genuine purpose has something that can't be faked. He has an axis. He has an internal reference point that doesn't depend on outside circumstances or on anyone's approval. He has something that matters to him more than the approval of any one specific person. And that makes him naturally less reactive, less anxious, less starved for attention. And that lowered reactivity, that lesser hunger for attention, is exactly what sparks curiosity in others, because curiosity doesn't switch on in response to what we already fully know and understand. It switches on in response to what we still can't fully decode, in response to something that has depth we haven't finished exploring, in response to something that, in some way, doesn't need us, but might still, on its own terms, choose us anyway. Viktor Frankl described something in his work that reaches far beyond seduction, but sheds an unexpected light on it. He spent years in concentration camps, living through the most extreme conditions of deprivation and violence a human being can face, and somehow walked away with a conclusion he spent the rest of his life defending. The conclusion was that a man who has a why can bear almost any how, and in our context, that why is what keeps you steady when someone doesn't respond, what lets you keep going when a dynamic doesn't turn out the way you